The last thing Daniel saw before he closed his eyes was the red light ahead, still 40 yards away. He had time. He always had time. But sometimes, time isn't what we think it is. We tell ourselves we're in control. We buckle our seatbelts, check our mirrors, follow the rules. We create these tiny rituals of safety, these fragile contracts with fate. But what happens when the universe decides to collect on a debt we never knew we owed? Daniel Morrison was the kind of man who measured his life in careful increments. At 34, he had built his existence around predictability. Same route to work every morning, same coffee shop on 5th Street, same parking spot 3 blocks from his office. His Honda Civic had 127,000 miles on it, and he knew every sound it made, every vibration in the steering wheel. His wife Sarah used to tease him about his routines. "You're like a Swiss watch," she'd say, watching him organize his keys the same way every evening. Precise, reliable, and just a little bit obsessive. She'd died 2 years ago. Cancer, quick and merciless. And since then, Daniel's routines had become something more than habits. They were anchors in a world that had already proven it could shift without warning. This particular Tuesday morning had started like any other. He'd made his coffee at 6:47 a.m., checked the weather app twice, and backed out of his driveway at exactly 7:23. The November sky was that particular shade of gray that promised rain, but hadn't delivered yet. Daniel had driven this route 1,247 times. He'd counted once during a particularly lonely evening, and he knew every pothole, every traffic pattern, every quirk of timing. He'd been thinking about Sarah as he drove, the way he often did during these morning commutes, about how she used to leave little notes in his lunch bag, about the way she hummed off key in the shower, about the plans they'd made for their 10th anniversary trip to Ireland that would never happen. These weren't painful thoughts anymore, exactly. They'd settled into something softer, like old photographs that had faded just enough to be beautiful rather than heartbreaking. The intersection at Miller and Broadway was notorious for its poorly timed lights. Daniel had complained to the city council 3 times about it, had written letters that went unanswered, but he'd learned to navigate it like everything else in his life, with patience, with attention, with the quiet confidence that comes from doing the same thing the same way hundreds of times. He was running about 2 minutes ahead of schedule that morning, which meant he could afford to coast a little as he approached the intersection. The light was green, but he could see it would change soon. He'd calculated it perfectly. He'd slow down just enough to catch the next cycle without having to stop completely. It was a small victory, the kind of minor efficiency that made Daniel feel like he had some measure of control over his world. Daniel was 37 feet from the intersection when he first saw the pickup truck. It appeared in his peripheral vision like a dark blur, traveling east on Miller at what had to be 50 miles per hour in a 25 zone. There was no brake light, no indication that the driver had any intention of stopping for what was clearly a red light. Time collapsed into mathematics. Distance, speed, vectors of collision. In that crystalline moment of recognition, Daniel's mind performed calculations he didn't know he was capable of. The truck would enter the intersection in 1.2 seconds. Daniel would be in the center of it in 1.3 seconds. The margin of survival was 1/10 of 1 second, the length of a heartbeat, the duration of a blink. He could have swerved left into oncoming traffic. He could have slammed his brakes and hoped momentum would be kind. He could have laid on his horn and prayed that sound travels faster than inevitability. Instead, in that 1 second before impact, Daniel Morrison closed his eyes. It wasn't surrender, exactly. It wasn't fear, though fear was certainly there, bright and electric in his chest. It was something more profound than either. A sudden, overwhelming understanding that some moments are too large for human intervention. That sometimes, all we Pabia can do is exist within them, fully and completely, without the illusion of control we spend our lives constructing. In that darkness behind his eyelids, Daniel felt Sarah's presence more clearly than he had in 2 years. Not as memory, not as grief, but as something immediate and warm. He thought of the notes she used to leave him, particularly the last one he'd found, weeks after the funeral, tucked inside his copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. Every ending is also a door. The sound of crushing metal filled the world. Glass became snow. Physics became poetry. And for one perfect, terrible second, Daniel Morrison understood exactly what his wife had meant. Daniel woke up 4 days later in room 237 of St. Mary's Hospital, with a splitting headache and 3 broken ribs. The first thing he saw was Detective Maria Santos sitting in the orange vinyl chair beside his bed, holding a small notebook and wearing the kind of expression that police officers reserve for delivering news that changes everything. "Mr. Morrison," she said gently, "we need to talk about what happened." The pickup truck's driver had been 19 years old. Marcus Chen, a college freshman running late for his morning shift at a warehouse job he needed to pay for textbooks. He'd been texting his girlfriend, telling her he loved her, when he ran the red light. He died on impact, the same impact that had somehow, miraculously, left Daniel alive. The physics of the collision were brutal in their randomness. Marcus's truck had clipped the rear quarter panel of Daniel's Honda at precisely the angle needed to send it spinning rather than crushing it completely. Daniel's car had rotated 3 full times before coming to rest against a light pole, and those rotations had absorbed just enough energy to leave him breathing. "The paramedics said you were conscious when they arrived," Detective Santos told him. "You kept asking about the other driver. You were bleeding from a head wound, had glass in your hair, and you wanted to know if he was okay." Daniel remembered none of this. What he remembered was the darkness behind his eyelids, the feeling of Sarah's presence, and the strange peace that had settled over him in that moment of surrender. He remembered understanding, with perfect clarity, that some things are beyond our control, and that perhaps that's exactly as it should be. The guilt came later, in waves. Marcus Chen had been someone's son, someone's boyfriend, someone's hope for the future. He'd been working 2 jobs to pay for college, had been planning to propose to his girlfriend after graduation. His death was senseless, arbitrary, the kind of loss that makes people question whether there's any meaning in the universe at all. But slowly, as Daniel healed, he began to understand something else. That moment of closing his eyes hadn't been about giving up. It had been about acceptance, about recognizing that life's most profound moments often exist in the spaces between our attempts to control them. 6 months later, Daniel still drives, the same route to work. But he's different now. He leaves earlier, drives slower. He's joined a support group for accident survivors, where he's learned that trauma can be a teacher as well as a burden. He volunteers at the local literacy center, reading to children who remind him that every story, even the painful ones, deserves to be heard. And sometimes, when he approaches that intersection at Miller and Broadway, Daniel thinks about those 1/10 of a second that separated life from death. He thinks about Marcus Chen, about roads not taken, about the infinite complexity of the moments that define us. He keeps his eyes open now. But he's learned that sometimes, closing them at exactly the right moment isn't surrender. It's the deepest kind of courage we possess. We all have our 1 second before moments, those instants when everything changes, when the universe reveals its true nature. What matters isn't whether we see them coming, but how we choose to exist within them. What's your 1 second before story? Share it in the comments below, and remember to subscribe for more stories about the moments that make us human. Because sometimes the most profound courage isn't about keeping our eyes open. It's about trusting that whatever comes next, we have the strength to survive it.